By 1944, the skies over the Pacific had changed forever. For years, Japan's Zero fighters had ruled the air fast, agile, and feared. But the Empire's confidence began to crumble when a new predator appeared over the horizon, sleek, silver, and screaming with power. The P-51 Mustang. It came not from the sea, but from the distant airfields of Iwo Jima and the Mariana Islands. It flew higher, faster, and longer than anything Japan had ever faced. Its pilots could dive through the clouds at impossible speeds, strafe airfields, destroy factories, and still have enough fuel to fly home. To the Japanese, it was not just an aircraft, it was a storm. Every radar alarm that blared across Tokyo in those final years carried one word of dread: Mustang. The first wave hit the capital on a quiet morning. People looked up to see silver dots glinting in the sun. Then the roar came, like thunder from the heavens. In minutes, the sky was on fire. Trains, airstrips, even supply trucks, hidden in forests, all were hunted. The Japanese Air Force tried to fight back, but their planes couldn't climb high enough, couldn't chase fast enough, couldn't escape. The Mustang pilots flew with unmatched precision. They moved like wolves in the wind, circling, striking, vanishing. And for the first time, Japan realized the air no longer belonged to them. The Empire's sky was now American. The story of the P-51 Mustang began not in battle, but in a quiet design office thousands of miles away from the war. In 1940, before America had even entered the fight, the British came to a small company called North American Aviation with an urgent request. They needed a new fighter. Fast. Something that could outclimb the German Messerschmitts and escort bombers deep into enemy skies. What followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering miracles of the war. Within 120 days, the first prototype was complete. It was fast, smooth, and beautiful, but it lacked the heart of a true killer. That heart would come later, from a decision that changed aviation forever, to replace its engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that roared inside the Spitfire. When the Merlin met the Mustang's body, something magical happened. The aircraft could climb higher, fly longer, and run faster than anything else in the sky. It could travel nearly 2,000 kilometers without refueling, escort bombers all the way to Berlin or Tokyo, and still dogfight on the way home. It was the perfect mix of British engineering and American speed, a weapon born from cooperation and desperation alike. Pilots who first flew it described the experience as pure power. They said it felt alive, responsive, agile, unbreakable. At full throttle, it could reach speeds that stunned even test engineers. It was a plane that didn't just fight the enemy, it hunted them. By the time the U.S. entered the Pacific War, the Mustang had evolved into a legend. Its long-range ability meant it could escort bombers all the way from the Marianas to Tokyo, a journey Japan once thought impossible for any aircraft. Now, that impossible flight was routine. The Mustang had become the sword America would use to carve its path through the Pacific. And for the Japanese, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that came from the clouds. In the early months of 1944, Japanese pilots began to notice something strange in the skies above the Pacific. The American bombers that once came alone were now escorted by sleek silver fighters that refused to turn back. They didn't just defend, they dominated. At first, Japanese commanders believed these were the same old American P-42s or Lightnings with new paint. But when their Zero squadrons engaged, they quickly learned the terrifying truth. The enemy fighters could climb faster, dive deeper, and recover quicker than anything Japan could send into the air. Dogfights that once lasted minutes were over in seconds. The Mustang pilots came screaming from the sun, their engines howling like thunder. They would strike, fire, and vanish before the Japanese could even react. In one engagement near Tokyo Bay, an entire flight of Zeros was destroyed before a single American plane took damage. Pilots who survived returned to base pale and shaken, muttering the same word over and over: Mustang. Reports flooded Imperial headquarters. Squadrons were vanishing mid-air. Air bases were burning before takeoff. And the most chilling detail? The Americans could now reach Japan itself, something that had once seemed unthinkable. In the beginning, Many Japanese believed the Mustangs were ghost planes, piloted by machines or demons. Their speed and altitude were unnatural, their endurance impossible. When radar screens picked up their approach, commanders often refused to believe it. How can fighters come from that far? They would ask. But by the time they looked up, the silver shapes were already over the city. To the people below, they seemed to appear from nowhere, shining in sunlight like blades. They came not in hundreds, but in dozens, and yet their presence silenced the ground. Every anti-aircraft gun, every pilot, every soldier understood one thing. Japan no longer ruled the skies. The empire that once soared now looked upward in fear. The P-51 Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol that the age of Japan's aerial supremacy was over. The hunter had become the hunted. As 1944 bled into 1945, Japan found itself fighting an enemy it could no longer see, no longer predict, and no longer outfly. The once proud Imperial Air Force, built on speed, maneuverability, and courage, was being dismantled by science and range. Every new strategy they tried, every new aircraft they built, fell short against the Mustang's impossible reach. Commanders ordered new prototypes, the Ki-84 Hayate, the J-2M Raiden, even experimental interceptors designed to climb fast enough to strike the American invaders. But resources were thin, fuel was scarce, and the pilots, the heart of Japan's air power, were vanishing faster than replacements could arrive. In training schools across Japan, young men were rushed into cockpits with barely a month of flight experience. They would take off with dreams of glory, and within hours their names were erased from the rolls. The Mustang ruled the skies with a kind of casual cruelty. Its pilots had range and time on their side. They could circle high above, invisible in the glare of the sun, waiting for the moment to dive. When they struck, the Japanese fighters never stood a chance. A burst of .50 caliber fire, a flash of flame, and another, zero, spiraled down. On the ground, Japanese engineers worked desperately. They stripped down planes to make them lighter, replaced armor with wood, even removed radios to save weight. Nothing worked. The Mustang's speed was unmatched, its endurance superhuman. It could fight, escort, and chase, all in one mission. Morale began to collapse. Pilots whispered that the Americans had invented something unnatural. A plane that never tired. A machine that could sense its prey. Even the most skilled aces began to avoid confrontation, climbing higher and higher in futile attempts to escape. But the Mustang followed. It always followed. From Okinawa to Tokyo, from the Pacific Islands to the home skies of Japan, there was no refuge. The Empire's engineers could build walls of steel, but they could not build walls in the air. Every flight became a prayer, every takeoff a farewell. By now, Japanese intelligence knew the truth. The P-51's arrival had ended their air war. The Empire still had soldiers, still had ships, still had courage, but courage could not outrun a Mustang. At dawn on March 4th, 1945, the people of Tokyo awoke to a strange sound, a deep, distant hum, rolling in waves across the sky. At first, they thought it was thunder, but as the sound grew louder, sharper, and closer, fear rippled through the city. Civilians ran to shelters. Soldiers looked upward, and then they saw them silver shapes glinting in the morning sun, slicing through the clouds. The Mustangs had come to Tokyo. For years, Japan had believed its homeland was untouchable. The Pacific Ocean, once their greatest barrier, was now a runway. The American bombers arrived with their deadly escorts, the P-51 seconds flying from captured airfields in Iwo Jima and Saipan. They came in waves, escorting the massive B-29 superfortresses that darkened the sky. And when enemy planes dared to rise in defense, the Mustangs were waiting. They struck with surgical precision. Airfields were shredded, hangars ripped apart, fuel depots ignited in pillars of fire. Japanese interceptors tried to climb, but the Mustangs fell upon them like hawks from the heavens. Fast, merciless, unstoppable. Every explosion echoed like a heartbeat of defeat. From the streets below, civilians watched the once invincible Imperial Air Force dissolve in smoke. Children pointed at the sky. Elders prayed. The roar of the Mustangs became the soundtrack of despair, a constant reminder that the war had come home. Pilots of the Japanese Zero squadrons described it later as the day the sky betrayed us. Even their best aces could not match the Mustang's climb, speed, or turning power. One Japanese veteran recalled, "They attacked from the Sunday. You didn't see them until the tracers were already passing you. It was over before you could even breathe." The raids over Tokyo changed everything. Factories stopped production. Pilots refused to take off without fuel or escorts. And ordinary citizens began to understand that the war was lost not on land, but in the air above their own homes. The P-51 Mustang had done what no weapon before it could do. It turned the Empire's skies into enemy territory. And for the first time in centuries, Japan looked upward, not with pride, but with fear. For the men who flew the P-51 Mustang, the war was both a triumph and a torment. From the cockpit, Japan stretched out like an endless sea of gray and smoke. The morning light reflected off rivers and rooftops. And in those moments before battle, there was silence. A silence broken only by the deep growl of the Merlin engine beneath their feet. They were young, most barely 20. They had names and faces that could have belonged to farm boys or mechanics back home. But in the sky, they became something else, predators of precision, guardians of bombers that carried the weight of war. When the order came, bandits spotted 2 o'clock high. They dropped their tanks, pushed their throttles, and became lightning. Through their gun sights, Japan was not a map, but a maze of targets. Airfields, trains, fuel depots, factories, all blurred into motion beneath their wings. Each mission demanded hours of endurance, balancing fuel, altitude, and the constant awareness that one mistake meant never returning. The Mustang was fast, but it was unforgiving. If the engine faltered over the Pacific, there was nowhere to go but down. Yet inside the cockpit, there was an unspoken rhythm, man and machine breathing together. The pilots described it as flying inside a thought. The controls answered instantly, the wings cutting through air like a blade through silk. One pilot said later, "You didn't fly a Mustang. You wore it." They saw things no one should ever see. Cities burning, enemy pilots ejecting into flame. The horizon lit by war. Some came home silent, staring at the sky long after landing, haunted by the beauty and horror they had witnessed together. Among them were heroes' names that filled newspapers, but most remained unknown, their victories written in logbooks and forgotten. They didn't speak of revenge. They spoke of survival. Every time they returned from a mission, they counted the planes on the runway. If too many were missing, the celebration ended before it began. They were young, brave, and burdened with the knowledge that each flight brought them closer to ending a war, but at a cost only they could understand. The Mustang had given them wings to dominate the sky, but it had also shown them what domination truly meant. By the summer of 1945, Japan's sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. The once mighty squadrons of the Imperial Air Force had withered to a handful of desperate pilots and fading machines. The P-51 Mustangs roamed freely, slicing across the horizon like silver ghosts, hunting anything that dared to rise. Air bases stood in ruins. Hangars were charred skeletons. Planes were hidden under camouflage nets or buried in fields to escape detection, but nothing escaped the Mustang's eye. When American pilots looked down, they no longer saw an air force, they saw wreckage. The last Japanese fighters were flown by boys who had never seen combat before. Their training was short, their planes underpowered, their fuel mixed with pine oil and prayer. They rose into the sun out of duty, not hope. Each mission ended the same, a flash, a spiral, a trail of black smoke dissolving into the wind. Mustang pilots later spoke of pity more than pride. They no longer faced equals in the sky. They faced ghosts of a defeated empire, still flying because surrender felt more unbearable than death. From Okinawa to Honshu, the Americans owned the air. The sky had become an empire of its own. one painted silver by the wings of the Mustang. When Tokyo finally burned beneath the firestorms of 1945, the Mustangs circled high above, untouched. They had done their job too well. The Japanese could not move, could not supply, could not breathe without being watched from above. The rising sun still fluttered on flags below, but in the sky, it had set forever. The war in the air was over long before the war on the ground ended. The P-51 had not just defeated Japan's fighters, it had erased their purpose. The empire had fallen from the clouds before it ever surrendered on land. For those who lived beneath the Mustangs, war no longer came in the form of soldiers or ships, it came from the sky. Every morning began with the same anxious ritual. Listening. If the air was quiet too long, hearts began to race, because silence meant the Mustangs were near, in villages and cities alike. The people of Japan had learned to fear the hum of distant engines. They would stop mid-step, glance upward, and wait for the roar that followed. When it came, it was deafening a sound like the earth splitting open. The silver planes swooped low over rooftops, their shadows racing along the ground faster than any human could run. Children clung to their mothers, workers abandoned fields, and soldiers hid beneath bridges or inside tunnels carved into the hillsides. The Mustangs did not always drop bombs. Sometimes they came only to strafe supply lines, destroy trains, or simply remind Japan that the sky was no longer theirs. To the people below, even one Mustang felt like an army. There were stories whispered in the shelters that the Americans could see everything, that their planes never ran out of fuel, that their eyes could pierce through clouds and smoke. Some swore the pilots could see faces on the ground. It was not just fear of death, but of being seen, the terrifying sense that nowhere, not even the sky, offered mercy. Farmers watched as their fields burned from machine gun fire meant for supply trucks. Villagers dug makeshift graves near rice paddies, marking them with sticks because there was no time for stones. The war had become personal, immediate, and endless. And yet, beneath the terror, there was awe. Many who survived remembered the sight of the Mustangs glinting against the sun, terrible, beautiful, and unstoppable. One old man later said, "They came like the wind itself. You could not fight the wind." By then, every Japanese citizen knew the sound of the Merlin engine, a sound that meant run, hide, pray. The Mustang was not just America's weapon. It had become Japan's shadow, and no one on the ground could escape it. By August 1945, the roar that had haunted Japan for years began to fade. The sky that once trembled with the thunder of the Mustang's wings now stood eerily still. Cities lay in ruins. Airfields were silent. The rising sun had fallen not in flames this time, but in surrender. When Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio announcing Japan's capitulation, millions stood frozen. They listened not only to his words, but to the silence that followed. The silence of a sky that, for the first time in years, held no engines, no gunfire, no echo of death. The Mustangs had stopped flying. For the American pilots, it was a strange peace. They had spent months watching Japan burn beneath their wings. Now, they flew reconnaissance missions over a quiet country. A country that looked wounded, motionless, and fragile from above. The same pilots who had once unleashed fire now gazed down at the wreckage and felt the weight of what victory truly meant. In hangars across Iwo Jima, the Mustangs sat lined like statues, their wings scarred and their paint dulled by salt and war. Mechanics cleaned them one last time, wiping away soot and blood, as if preparing them for rest after years of relentless flight. Pilots walked among them in silence, running their hands along the metal skin that had carried them through the storm. For some, the end of the war brought relief. For others, it brought an emptiness that words could not reach. Over Tokyo, the air was still. Smoke drifted upward from ruins that once glowed with flame. Children who had grown up hiding from the roar now stood in open streets, staring at the clouds that no longer trembled. The sky was theirs again, though it felt strange, unfamiliar, almost too quiet. And somewhere far out at sea, on the deck of a carrier bathed in sunset, a Mustang pilot looked eastward toward the homeland of his enemy. He didn't feel triumph. He felt exhaustion and a small hope that the silence would last longer than the war had. For Japan, the Mustang had been terror. For America, it had been power. But for the men who flew them, it was something else entirely. It was the sound of duty, of endurance, of a sky that demanded everything. And when that sound finally stopped, the world below knew the war was truly over. In the years that followed the war, the P-51 Mustang became more than a machine. It became a symbol. Its silver wings came to represent not just victory, but the price of domination. For Japan, it was the echo of defeat. For America, the image of technological triumph. And for the world, it marked the moment when the sky itself became the battlefield that decided empires. Historians called it the plane that ended the air war. In the press, it was the first true long-range fighter, the aircraft that could escort bombers across oceans, chase enemies from the clouds, and return home untouched. Its success was not born from power alone, but from intelligence design meeting destiny at exactly the right moment in history. It had outflown the Zeros, outrun the Messerschmitts, and outlasted every threat that tried to meet it in the air. But the legacy of the Mustang was not only written in victories. It was written in silence, the silence that followed every battle it ended, every city it left, smoldering below. Pilots who flew her spoke of a strange beauty, a feeling that they were part of something greater than war itself, a fusion of speed, precision, and purpose that few would ever know again. When the guns fell quiet, the Mustangs found new homes. Some were sold, some scrapped, and a few kept alive as relics of the most powerful fighter ever built. Decades later, when their engines roar again in air shows, people still look up in awe, hearing the same haunting sound that once made a nation tremble. In Japan, memories of that sound lingered for generations. Elders spoke softly of the silver planes that ruled their skies, how the air once screamed, and how silence felt heavier after they were gone. The Mustang was not just a weapon, it was a warning that whoever commands the skies commands the world below. From the ashes of Tokyo to the open runways of the modern world, its legend still flies, a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and consequence. The P-51 Mustang did more than defeat an enemy. It changed the future of war forever. And in every whisper of wind that rushes past a flying wing, you can still hear its spirit, the roar of the machine that made the world look up and never see the sky the same way again.